This is called Don't Shoot the Messenger. Kind of self-defense.
Cover your butt on that.
Yeah, I am. This is actually 2 parts. I couldn't do this all in one. I wasn't brave enough. Psalm 95. Harden not your heart as in the provocation, as in the day of temptation in the wilderness when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my work. 40 years long was I grieved with this generation and said, it's a people that err in their heart. Why was God grieved? He said, because it's a people that do err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. This is so powerful. How did we miss this? Unto whom I swear in my wrath that they should not enter into my wrath. The word resist, out of the dictionary, means to oppose and to hinder and to frustrate. It means to refuse to accept. It means to impede, to object, and to obstruct. To object and to obstruct. The words object and obstruct are both made of dual words, dual Latin words, and they begin with OB. OB. OB always has to do with seeing, like obstetrics, so we're all, observe, not obstetric. Observe. We don't want to do with seeing them. In Psalm 95, God's grieved with Israel in the wilderness season. And the reason is that they've hardened their hearts, which results in the inability to see and understand. God said the reason that I'm angry with Israel is because they err in the way that they see. Their error is in their perception. And they refuse to see, and because of this, they harden their hearts. Look at verse 10 by itself. Did you have that up there? Good one. 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, and it's a people that err in their heart. And because of this, they don't know my ways. God spoke the reason for His frustration. They think, this is literally the translation, they think and they believe wrong. It's really scary.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
When I saw that lady on the news, I went, wow, she doesn't think right. She believes wrong.
Yeah.
One thing you need to know is that God is absolutely and truly a father. He's never upset when His children are wrong, because wrong is a part of growth. He is upset when they're arrogantly, unteachably, unchangeably wrong.
Yes. Right.
God's okay if you just don't get it, but when you say, I'm not going to get that, that's when God has a problem. He says, harden not your heart. How many know that you have the ability to harden your own heart?
Yes.
Literally translates, do not become stubborn and obstinate in your thinking, believing, and understanding. Don't become stubborn in the way that you believe that you can't be taught. This is what Solomon referred to as your own understanding when he said, lean not to your own understanding. Obstinate is unyielding. It's inflexible. It's strong-willed and uncompromising. It's unrelenting and unshakable and single-minded and bullheaded. Another word he used was pig-headed, but I didn't put that in there. For obstinate. You know, one of the words that the dictionary uses is also stiff-necked, which is also one of the Hebrew descriptions. Stiff-necked. All religion succeeds by making its people stiff-necked. That is the main success and strength of religion. Its people become stiff-necked and unteachable. All these things are actually seen as a positive trait when viewed through the religious eyes. If you said, I am unyielding or uncompromising or inflexible, unrelenting, unshakable, and all of a sudden we go, those are good things. But religious people might say they're all these things, But they don't say or refer to themselves as stiff-necked because that sounds negative. I'm uncompromising, but I'm not stiff-necked. But it's the same word.
Yes.
Unshakable, unyielding, and uncompromising are everything that religion aspires to become. It's funny when I was reading this, but one of the words for hard-hearted in the Hebrew is heavy. And I couldn't understand it, so I started to seek God. John 3:8. The wind blows where it listeth, and you hear the sound of it, but you can't tell where it's coming from or where it's going. So is everyone that is born of the Spirit. So is everyone born of the Spirit. Remember last week how we compared the swirling wind to those who move with God in the spirit realm? We talked about that. I thought that was such a good illustration. Let me ask you this. Have you ever seen leaves, I asked you last week, swirling about in the wind? How many have seen that?
Yes.
And it's like they're dancing with an invisible partner. It's such a beautiful picture of the Holy Spirit and the person who is filled with the Spirit. But let me ask you this. How many have ever seen bowling balls swirling in the wind? How about anvils? Doesn't it make you think of the Bugs Bunny? The stubbornly unchangeable. Remember, one of the words for hard-hearted is heavy. The stubbornly unchangeable have no... Get this. I didn't make this up. The stubbornly unchangeable have no ability to be moved by God's Spirit ever. They're moved by their soul, and they think it's their spirit because the soul can do that, but the Spirit doesn't. In Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about this series of unfortunate events that are going to occur in the last generation. And I can't get away from Matthew 24. So I want to show you a couple things that God showed me this week. Matthew 24, starting at verse 6. And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilence, earthquakes in divers places. And all these are what? The beginning of sorrows. Then they shall deliver you up to be afflicted. They'll kill you. You'll be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. I saw a thing this week on a guy that wrote a book. And I think he said he had interviewed like 1,000 people that had had near-death experiences. And all these people that had literally been clinically proven dead for minutes or however long had seen a place that they described as heaven. And these people, it had been children and grown-ups, and this guy was a scientist. And all these people, they were so accurately, so much like each other, they began to convince him that this was a real place and that these people weren't just having the last spasms of light in the brain before the brain finally went out. And one of the things that all these people said, and this was so cool to me, they said when the first person they saw is they got to see. They saw Jesus or they saw God. They saw the King. And they weren't sure like if this is God or if this is Jesus, or some of them weren't some of them. But they said every person that talked to God found that the most important thing, the most important thing to God, every one of them said the same thing. The most important thing to God, bar none, was love. The most important thing in God's book was still, in God, the personality of God and who God is, was love. Jesus said in the last day, iniquity is going to abound, and because of that, the love of many will wax cold. How many know Christians easily say, I love you? I've heard Christians say, I love you to people they don't even know. I hate that. Don't tell me you love me. You don't know me. There might be things about me that you like. If you knew me, I promise you would struggle. You ask Carol. Looks can only get you so far. It's absolutely true. Jesus said, but I thought that was cool. He said, God knew every part of what they were thinking and what they were, and they saw their entire life. But the only things that mattered were the things of mercy and love. They were like the only things that really counted for anything with God. Jesus said that there will be, in the last time, great offense. Offense begins always in the church. The church is considered by Christ to be the one who carries light. Isn't that true? Jesus said, you're the light of the world. So he said the offense begins in the church and eventually manifests itself in the world. And the world isn't light, but it's what? Reflective light, isn't it?
Yes.
The sun and the moon. He said he made two great lights. The sun to rule the day and the moon to rule the night. The moon is a reflective light. If the world's getting darker, whose fault is it? Still the church's. Isn't that true? It is true. Jesus said that this offense, the time of offense, will give rise to and open doors for. Now you've got to get this. I'm going to tell you some stuff, and you may go home offended. It's fine. Just come back next week so I can offend you again. Because I got some more. I'm like a soap opera. You've got to come back next week as the story continues. Jesus said that the offense will give rise to and open doors for false prophets. Didn't he say that? He said that there would be false prophets which would preach deceiving messages to the multitudes. That's what Jesus said. I didn't make any of this up. The multitude deceived, then he said, all these things just open doors. This opens a door for that, which opens a door for that, which opens a door for that. The multitude deceived would open the door to abounding iniquity, which would result in love waxing cold, which is the end of that whole mentality because God despises that. Because God is all about love.
Yeah.
Yet he still has enemies. We don't understand God. He's God. Don't try to figure him out. Just understand what he's telling you. I want to look at Matthew 24:9 again. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted and shall kill you, and you'll be hated of all nations for my name's sake. In the American mentality, we see the church in the United States as being the church. And we see ourselves as the ones that Jesus is prophesying about. Isn't that true? We're always going, we're waiting for this, for them to come in and begin killing us because we know that's the next step. But you've got to remember this. We are only 5% of the global population. That's it. The vast majority of the church is still outside of the United States. How many believe that? The church has suffered literally major persecution since its inception. Voice of the Martyrs claims that there have been 70 million Christians killed over the last 2,000 years. 70 million. 70 million. Not just to have died, murdered over the last 2,000 years. And that Christianity is literally a hated nation worldwide, fulfilling what Jesus already prophesied in Matthew 24. So if you're waiting for the killing to come to this nation, you're about 2,000 years too late. It's been happening. So that part of the prophecy has been being fulfilled since the beginning. How many would agree with that?
Yes.
It's absolutely true. Look at verse 10 again. Then shall, after they deliver them up to be killed, then shall many be offended and shall betray one another and shall hate one another. Let me ask you this question. How many have ever lost a family member or a loved one to a hate crime? How many have ever had somebody in your family or somebody you were close to killed through a hate crime? Which, how many know that whenever somebody's killed for their faith, it's a hate crime? If they attack a believer in another country and they kill them, then that's considered a crime against the religion. It's a hate crime. Let me ask you this. Imagine how it would feel to have a son or a daughter viciously slaughtered for their faith. How would you feel if it was your child or your loved one? In other countries, Christians are dismembered and disfigured and then left to attempt to survive without hands, feet, and limbs. How many have seen that in publications? Yeah. Their girls are brutally raped and abused, and many times they have their breasts hacked off, have their eyes gouged out, their ears cut off, their noses are cut off, their faces are disfigured, and then they're left like that. You can read about it and get Voice of the Martyrs or get any one of the publications that talks about overseas persecution. How many know to us here in the United States that's not like a reality, it's more like a movie or something that we can't hardly fathom? Yeah. How many know, sure, we can pray for them, or sure, we can send them money. But let me ask you this, how do you fix the psychological damage of that person? Literally, seriously, say that's your child, and they've been brutally messed up in some way. How do you fix the psychological damage, and how do you get over what has happened to that person that you loved and that you still love? How do you convince someone that has to struggle every hellish minute of every day for the rest of their life that everything's going to be all right? What if that happens when they're a child and they've got to live another 50 or 60 years like this? Every time they go to do something, their hands have been cut off, or their feet, and they've got to drag themselves up. Somebody has to, for the rest of their life, how do you deal? How do you emotionally and mentally deal with that? Do you know what that would do to you? We can only imagine. We can't literally say, yeah, I know how you feel, because we don't. So we can only imagine. Christian publications may paint a picture of persecuted people with an all's well mentality, and I'm sure that may exist, that they say we are just still serving the Lord, but what about the dark times 5 years later, 10 years later? What about down the road when that person has just felt like a burden for everybody else around them that they've got to live? What about the young person that has had their face and body horribly mutilated, and now they've got to look at themselves every day and realize that they have this long, painful life ahead? How can you, with a comfortable life of ease, offer them anything that will give them real relief? You can give them beautiful words, you can send them money, but can you offer them true relief? Jesus said that the abuse of humanity would cause many to be offended. That's putting it pretty lightly. How many know that's an understatement? Many would be offended and become self-preserving and hateful. How many would have a hard time being okay with the person that did that to your child? Or to your wife or your husband or your mother or father? How many would just be okay? I forgive them, Lord, it's fine. How many know that a lot of people struggle with those issues daily, today? It's not a future thing. This is what's happening now. It's something that's been happening since the church came into existence 2,000 years ago. Before Constantine's Edict of Milan in the beginning of the 4th century, all Christians that were caught were abused and killed. All, for 400 years. How many know the United States has not been in business near that long? Right? For 400 years, until the Edict of Milan, every Christian that was caught, in fact, the Christians got so arrogant about it. If you read about early Christians, Christians weren't always pious and humble. How many believe that's true? Yes. How many have ever met somebody that wasn't humble? Christians used to taunt. They would stand in these theaters and taunt the people before they were killed. In fact, they would offer themselves up as martyrs to the point where the Roman governor said, listen, there's enough rope out there or cliffs. If you want to take your life, go hang yourself or jump off a cliff. That's true. That is historically correct. Because the Christians were offering themselves up. But for 300 years, they were being persecuted. Let me ask you this. If you were being persecuted for over 300 years, how would that change your doctrine? Seriously, think about this. How much would it alter your ability to love and forgive people? If it happens once, the Mennonites forgave everybody because they killed their kids. Remember, that was like started this big thing where you've got to forgive the murderer. And so, but what if they did it to your grandparents' generation? And your great-grandparents, and your mom and dad's generation, and they had brothers and sisters that had been abused and killed. And then your own family, and then your own children. How would you not eventually begin to become bitter toward the people that abused you? But Jesus said it was going to happen. Jesus didn't say this might happen. He said, here's what's going to happen, folks. You're going to be abused until you become bitter. That's what he said. They're going to kill you until you hate them. That's what he said. We don't understand that because we don't even know anybody that's suffered like that. We don't even know anybody. We all want to think that if this happened to us, we would remain spiritual and very emotionally unscathed. And maybe the people back then did too. Maybe they did for a generation or two or three. Maybe. But eventually, how many would say, enough is enough. We're tired of dying. This is 300 years. How many know the devil knows psychological warfare and he knows how to wear men down?
Yes.
And he was given an opportunity. When Jesus prophesied this, he wasn't giving a warning about something that was avoidable. He was saying, this is how it's going to work, and there's nothing you can do to change it. He actually begins this sermon with the only warning. Look at the beginning of the sermon in verse 4. And Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you. That's the only take heed that he says. This is the main thrust of the entire thing. Jesus said, take heed that you're not deceived. And then he begins telling you, this is what's going to happen. So you've got to understand. How many believe in your heart that you have successfully avoided all deception? What if it wasn't you personally? What if it wasn't you personally that was deceived? Look at Genesis 3:1. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, yea, as God said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden. The Bible says the serpent was subtle. Subtle means cunning and deceitful. How many know the devil's a master of deception? Who made the serpent? God did. God made him a master of deception. I'm stating the obvious. I'm just stating what it says. Let me ask you this. How would a master deceiver think? In order for the ruse to be the most effective, it would have to be camouflaged. You can't deceive the majority of the people by offering them a sudden change. A deceiver doesn't come along and say, no, follow this way. That's not the way of a deceiver. A deceiver works his way into the old ways.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he does it slowly and over time. You use multiple generations of time in order for the strategy to work. How many know the devil knew that he had time to work with, and so he did it over time?
Yeah.
Because it's effective. Slowly you alter the ways of thought and belief through generations of pain, through generations of sorrow and suffering. You alter the way people see and the way they think. People grow weary. Eventually they become compliant, unresisting, and docile after years of seemingly hopeless suffering, pain, and death. Slowly the deceiver stirs in his deception, a little bit at a time. The Spirit of God becomes silent. And over time, religion is accepted. And not only accepted, embraced. This suffering is what Jesus was understating in Matthew 24. He said that there would be suffering, but he didn't go into detail, so we don't realize that's what he was talking about. Then the suffering eventually softens the hard way of the multitude. And look at verse 11 again. And many false prophets shall rise and deceive. After the suffering of years of sorrow and pain of the church, all of a sudden, many false prophets rise and deceive. This isn't an event that's coming. Don't look around you trying to figure out who they are. That's what makes this so deceptive. We think it's ahead of us. It's easy to deceive somebody who thinks that it hasn't been happening already. It's not ahead of us. It's been happening. Jesus calls them false prophets. What's a false prophet? I want to look at this for a minute. First, he says that false prophets would be many. He said there will be many false prophets. But when we think of false prophets, again, we think of Jim Jones and David Koresh and Hare Krishna. I don't know if his first name was Harry. Isn't that true? We think Jehovah's Witness, and we think the Mormons, and we think, oh, this is the false prophets. He says many false prophets. The word many, literally, it's a Greek word. It means it becomes altogether common. It's the everyday standard. It's totally and completely normal. That is the absolute definition of that word. Many. How many have ever seen an eagle around here? Or take like, how many are impressed when you see an eagle? I had a friend the other day said he was back in the woods and an eagle landed 10 feet above him in a tree. I've seen them several times and they're impressive every time I see them. How many see an eagle every single day? It's not common, is it? When you see an eagle, you go, wow. How many say that? Yeah. I do. Wow. I had one day fly right beside my truck, just above the cab, right beside me. I was running 35 and it was flying the same speed for a long way. It was amazing. I said, wow. Must wreck. So to see an eagle, it's not a common thing, is it? How about a squirrel? How many have ever seen a squirrel? How many get excited and pull your car over when a squirrel crosses the road? How many hardly give it a second thought? Speed up and swerve. Jesus literally said false prophets would be as common as squirrels. That's what he said. You would just see them and think nothing of them. Look at Matthew 24:21. Then shall be great tribulation, such as was not from the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be short. This is so amazing. I've never heard anybody explain this. There should be no flesh saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Then if any man shall say to you, look, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and show great signs and wonders, insomuch that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. I don't like it. Jesus talks about a great worldwide trouble. King James Version calls it tribulation. And he says God intervenes only because of the sake of the elect. He doesn't say for Christians. I know that every Christian would say, that's us. It's not true. It's deception to believe that. If you've been taught that, you've been deceived. There's another one. It's not talking about Christians, and it's not talking about the church in general. The elect, when he says this, it's very important that we understand it. Remember in Matthew 22, when he said, many are called and few are chosen. Few are chosen. Many are called. The majority are called. They receive an invitation. Few are chosen. The word elect is the same word. It means chosen. It means selected. These didn't come by way of invitation. Like David, they were handpicked by God. Jesus chose 12 disciples. Out of that massive multitude of people, he chose 12 disciples. Out of those 12, he chose 3. And out of those 3, he chose John. John was his favorite. John the Beloved. He gave John, literally, the greatest revelation of any prophet in the New Testament.
Yeah.
Greater than Paul, greater than Peter, greater than any of the apostles, John was given the opportunity to walk in heaven and to see the future. John is the greatest prophet. He was picked by Jesus. The deep way of understanding was given to John. He was chosen for that. It's just God's way. If you don't like it, start your own religion. Or at least build your own kingdom. The multitude of people that followed Jesus, remember he had multitudes around him, these were those who were the called. They were common, everyday, normal, standard believers. In the multitudes, there are good and bad Christians alike. It doesn't make you part of the called or part of the chosen. If you're a good Christian, there's nothing you can do to be part of the chosen. God chooses whoever He wants to.
Amen.
It's always been that way. What's the difference between the called and the chosen? All believers are to be moved by the wind of the Spirit in their personal lives. This is the call of the called. That's the invitation of the called. To be moved by the Spirit in your personal life. The chosen of God, or the elect, are selected to hear the way of God for the corporate church prophetically from Christ Himself. And Jesus said that, and I'll show you. Look at Hebrews chapter 1. God, who in sundry times and in divers manners spoke in times past unto the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken unto us by His Son, whom He has appointed heir of all things, by whom also He made the worlds. When he wrote Hebrews, and they're 99% sure that it was Paul, in fact, he did. God spoke to the prophets in the Old Testament, who in turn spoke to the multitudes. How did the prophets know they were to prophesy? God picked them to do it. Is that right?
Yeah.
It's true. Now, Jesus, it was God in the Old Testament, but now Jesus, it says, speaks to the prophets in the New Testament, who in turn speak to the church. Again, the Old Testament prophets were selected by God, but in these last days, He's spoken unto us. Paul refers to himself as a prophet, spoken unto us by His Son. That's what he said. Now Jesus speaks. Paul calls us meaningless prophets. So where did the church stumble? How many want to know where the church stumbled? How many want to know why the world's getting darker?
Yeah.
How many want to know why there's so much confusion? Don't you want to know? I don't know. Where did the church stumble? The church always stumbles in their lack of understanding.
Yes.
Is that true? How many agree with that?
Yes.
Hosea said it, didn't he? The church has zero. How much is zero? Zero is a zero with the rim removed. It is less than nothing. The church has zero understanding of kingdom order. Never have. Look at Matthew 24:11 again. I'm trying to get through this. Many false prophets shall rise and shall deceive many. If there are true prophets selected by Jesus, then who are false prophets? True prophets are selected by Jesus. Isn't that what Paul said in Hebrews chapter 1? True prophets are selected by and spoken to through Jesus. So who are the false prophets? The word impostor means a deceiving imitator. It means a person who copies the behavior or the actions of another. False prophets. A false prophet is one who attempts to imitate the position of a true prophet. They deceive the multitudes even though they do it inadvertently. If you ask them, they absolutely have no desire to be deceptive. None. Zero. God revealed to me why it happened. Most of it I'm probably going to reveal to you next week. These imitators, Jesus said many men imitating prophets. Altogether common. It would become altogether common. Men imitating prophets. These imitators of prophets rise up. That's what he says. Many shall rise. It literally means to exalt self. To rise up out of something. They rise up, these imitating prophets, imitators of prophets, rise up out of where? The called multitudes. They are not part of the elect. They're not part of the chosen of God. They're part of the called. But they rise up out of the called. I know this is hard to swallow. What do they prophetically accomplish? John 2. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. This is the prophetic fulfillment of what has happened through the false prophets. The Jews mentioned here represent, when it talks about the Jews, it's talking about the Pharisees, the scribes, the leaders, the Jewish leadership. Jesus said that for 2 days or 2,000 years, they would destroy his body, the church. And in the third day, Jesus said, I will myself raise that body back up. So, exactly who was it that destroyed the way of the church? Remember this. I'm literally just the messenger. Don't shoot the messenger. Didn't make any of this up. Sit, listen, write. That's all I do. I'm a scribe. John 15. I'm the true vine, my Father's the husbandman. Every branch in me that bears not fruit, he takes away. Every branch that bears fruit, he purges it, that it might bring forth more fruit. Jesus refers to the Father as the husbandman. How many believe God is the husbandman of the vineyard? How many believe that? Didn't Jesus refer to him as that? How many say, Dan, yes, I can't agree with you on one thing, and that would be it. God is the Lord of the vineyard. Why is the vineyard so important to God? Look at verse 8. Herein is my Father glorified that you bear much fruit. So shall you be my disciples. God is glorified when the vineyard brings forth abundant fruit. Glorified has to do with light. The glory of God is the understanding or the light. If the world's getting darker, it's not the world's fault, it's the church's fault. And it's because the church's light has gotten dimmer. They have no understanding. My people are destroyed for their lack of understanding. If the light of God was continually increasing, would the world still be such a dark place? It wouldn't, would it? Who does God blame it on? Ready? Jeremiah 12. Many pastors have destroyed my vineyard. They've trodden my portion underfoot. Notice he says many. Same word Jesus used. They have made my pleasant portion a desolate wilderness. They have made it desolate. And being desolate, it mourns on me. The whole land is made desolate because no man lays it down. No man has understanding. That's what that means. God wants a vineyard that bears fruit. He said, pastors have turned. I didn't make any of this up. How many know I didn't write this? How many are all right with the fact that I didn't write this? Nobody can tell by my humility and fear that I didn't write this. Many pastors. The word many means the ever-increasing myriad or the overabundance of. In the kingdom of God, every position is chosen specifically. How many believe God has a kingdom? How many understand that a kingdom... Let me show you. John 14:2. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. This is one of the most misunderstood verses. You agree with it or not, but the word mansions does not mean giant houses. Just because they sing about it doesn't make it true. Just build my mansion next door to Jesus. Tell the angels I'm coming home. Many mansions literally translates. It doesn't translate giant houses. In fact, they didn't even have mansions when this was written. That Jesus would have said, in my Father's house are many mansions. They would have went, how about vehicles? The word mansions is the word rooms, levels, and positions. That's what it means. I didn't make this up. Rooms in my Father's house are many levels, many rooms, many positions. How many are thankful that there's a position for you? How many are thankful? David said, you know what? I'd just soon be the doorman.
Yes.
I don't even need to be anybody important. Just make me the door guy. That'll be the greeter. Welcome to Walmart. When Jesus was saying this, he was talking to who? Look where it's at, John 14. Who was he talking to? The disciples, right? There was no crowds involved. This is the last thing to the disciples. The last great pep talk before he leaves. The last couple chapters of John. In my Father's house, he said, are many positions. He's not talking to the crowds. He's talking to who? The chosen. That's who he's talking to. He said that he would go to the cross, and when he had retaken the kingdom, it would create positions of rulership. That's what it means. In my Father's house, in my Father's kingdom, there are many positions. I go to the cross to recapture the kingdom, and then I go ahead of you to make a place, a position for you to rule from. That's what that means. I mean, you can tell I didn't make that up. I'm not that intelligent. You don't have a mansion in heaven. I'm sorry. It's a myth that's been propagated by blind pastors. Who told you you did? Somebody down the road did that. Some pastor in the past. And it might not have been. He didn't even know. His pastor told him, and his pastor told him, and his... How many know that deception comes from generations? Yes. All deception. God told Jeremiah that pastors would be ever increasing, which would destroy his vineyard. How? Guess how? Through self-appointment. because God didn't select them for it. They just felt like that would be a good place to be. Jesus said that it would be so commonly accepted in society that even the very elect would be deceived. I always wondered, who in the world could deceive the chosen? Who else? The ones that we accept and embrace as having the truth. What an intelligent deception. You don't think he's subtle? You say, I'm not deceived, Dan. But let me ask you this. Isn't the lack of the awareness of deception the very nature and strength of the deception itself?
Right.
God told Hosea, my people, my vineyard, will be destroyed for the lack of knowledge. My vineyard is going to be trampled because of the lack of understanding. They don't have a spiritual understanding. They have a carnal understanding. Where does the church receive its lack of knowledge? Where is the source of the church's misunderstanding? If a team is consistently losing, who gets fired?
The coach.
Isn't it true? That's why he said, woe to the pastors. Jeremiah said, God said, right to Jeremiah, woe. How many know if somebody says, woe to you, you ain't digging it? How many know if God says woe?
Yeah.
That's pretty scary. Isn't the leadership always responsible? Isn't it always the leadership? Why don't we see that? If the church is confused, isn't the leadership responsible for the confusion?
Yes.
We need God to give us a greater understanding.
Yes,
Yes.
Lord. Yes.